National Guard was called in over the weekend by Ohio Governor James Rhodes. Today, when 1,500 students started an anti-war rally on the University Commons, the Guardsmen surrounded them. Then, when some students started throwing rocks, the Guard moved in with tear gas. The students were forced up a hill by the tear gas. Some of them started throwing gas canisters back at the Guardsmen. Others threw rocks. Then a formation of Guardsmen marched up the hill and fired their rifles at the students. Two young men and two young women were killed, and at least a dozen other students were wounded.
The Kent State shootings in May 1970 are remembered as essentially the bottoming out of the violent anti-Vietnam protest era. But the violent part of that era wasn't actually a very long period, though. I mean, there were protests against that war for a very long time. That movement was big and sustained over a long period of years. But protests against the Vietnam War did go on for years before they ever became violent, before they ever became anything like when those people died at Kent State at the rifles and bayonets of National Guard troops. Anti-war protests had been nonviolent, and then they became violent. What happened in Kent State didn't come out of nowhere. It wasn't some sort of gradual thing. The Vietnam protest era went from nonviolent to violent on one specific day, 3 years before Kent State happened. It was a day in Madison, Wisconsin. Watch.
I was in my office working on my research when a number of students barged through the door and said, Professor Zeitlin, you've got to come. The police are massing outside of the Commerce Building. It looks like they're going to go in there and they're going to start beating up students. So I dash across the street to the Commerce Building, standing there wearing helmets and carrying billy clubs, really prepared for war, were the police from the city of Madison.
The university wanted us to go in and clear the building. And they didn't say how, they just said, we want them removed. And we said, fine.
Just in an instant, they came at me and grabbed me. They just proceeded to alternatively club me. And somebody just whacked me on the base of the spine.
You either grab somebody, you hit somebody, you knock them down, and you step over. The line behind you picks that guy up, throws him back to the line behind, who takes him and throws him out the doors that we just came in. Literally, we had stacked up bodies like cordwood between the doors. And it wasn't revenge on anything. If you got a student, you tried to make sure that he didn't return, that he didn't want to come back. And if that meant, breaking his kneecap, that's what you did.
People were trying to get out. And as the people were trying to get out, they were beating people up with billy clubs, as hard as they could. And you could hear the whack. "65 people were sent to the hospital. It was the most brutal and violent thing I had ever witnessed in my life up until then, and continues to be the most brutal and violent thing I have ever witnessed in my life.
We think of the anti-Vietnam protests with Kent State as the capstone, as this era of violent protest in the United States. But there was a day on which those protests became violent, and it was something that happened specifically because of the way those protests were policed. At Madison, Wisconsin, that was the first major violence at an anti-Vietnam War protest. Politically, people did not like the protests. They wanted them not to happen. The university came under pressure to try to make the protests go away. So instead of letting the protests be handled by the campus police that had a good relationship with students, police officers speaking with students on relatively easy terms. The campus police didn't wear riot gear. They didn't even carry weapons in most cases. They had been handling it up until this point. But under pressure, the campus instead decided to go hard, to bring in the city police. They didn't give them any instruction. They just told them to go hard. And the city police had no relationship with that community at all, no history with them at all. And they came in and they cracked heads. literally cracked heads. They put 65 people in the hospital on the first protest that they were in charge. Before that policing decision was made, nothing was going to be different about that protest. It certainly wasn't the first. But the police, the change in policing tactics that day in Madison, turned that protest and thereby turned the Vietnam-era protest movement that day into something dangerous and ultimately consequential for the whole country. That changed the tone for the nation. It is very hard to turn back once you have effectively waged war on your own people. Well, in the wake of what happened there in 1967, ultimately, Madison, Wisconsin did turn back. They turned back famously under this police chief who they hired in 1973, and then they held on to him in Madison for 20 years. He's a man named David Couper. And under David Couper, Madison essentially repented for what they had started in 1967, and they developed their own model of de-escalating, participatory community policing that instead of cracking heads would be designed to facilitate protest, protect people's right to express themselves and speak and assemble, even if they wanted to be rowdy. As long as they weren't breaking the law or endangering anybody, the police were there to just make sure everybody would be safe and could express themselves. David Couper became a national advocate, an international advocate for demilitarizing policing, for engaging with the public, for being a police force that looked like the local population, that represented the local population, that was trusted by them. It can be done. Madison did a 180 on this, and they're considered to be the national model for community policing. And if you're curious as to what community policing actually is, what it actually looks like, the best way to imagine it is probably as the opposite of this. These are the images from last night and the last couple of nights in Ferguson, Missouri, where the initial crisis was police fatally shooting an unarmed African-American teenager this past weekend. But that crisis has quickly evolved in Ferguson into a rolling conflict between a community trying to protest, trying to express its grief and anguish and protest and anger about that shooting. But that community being met by, in effect, a military response. I should note, though, a lot of U.S. military veterans are actually objecting to that characterization of what's going on in Ferguson, saying as troops, they would have never behaved like that even in a combat zone. Amid anger and anguish over this police shooting, what we have seen since is police failure on a massive, massive and consequential scale.
Across the city, a night of pure chaos.
This is your warning. Leave the area. Disperse.
Racial tensions and nerves on edge. Even an officer we caught on camera gave into his rage, calling protesters animals. Listen.
Bring it.